This woman has no business being on this plane. People like her are always causing trouble. Catherine Langford shouted, her perfectly manicured fingers stabbing the air in accusation. She was pointing directly at a black woman standing opposite her in the New York Gateway International Airport boarding area. I don't know how she even got in this line, but I'm not getting on this flight until she's arrested and removed. Catherine's voice was shrill with outrage. She's obviously sneaking her way into first class because someone like her does not belong here. Catherine, a white woman whose presence oozed entitlement, gripped the handle of her designer handbag with perfectly polished nails. Her expression twisted in sheer disgust, her piercing blue eyes burning with misplaced authority. The airport was packed with weary travelers eager to board their flights, yet Catherine's outburst sliced through the hum of conversation like a blade. Heads turned, conversations halted. Some passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to intervene or step away. Others simply watched, curiosity flickering in their eyes. And standing in the center of it all, poised and calm, was Naomi Carter. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't argue, she didn't need to. Her mere presence was enough to make it clear. Catherine Langford had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Naomi Carter was grace personified, intelligent, composed, and effortlessly elegant. A black woman who had built her success on resilience, not privilege. To the untrained eye, to someone blinded by prejudice, she was just another passenger. And that was exactly how she wanted it. Dressed in a simple yet stylish travel outfit, Naomi had no desire to flaunt her wealth or power. In fact, no one on this flight, not even the airline staff, knew who she really was. No one knew that she was the CEO and chief board member of Airline Airways, one of the country's most successful airlines. Naomi never chased validation. She had been out of the country for years, and even her own employees barely recognized her. She rarely attended board meetings in person, often sending representatives instead. A week ago, she had returned to the US and decided to fly on one of her own airline's commercial routes, anonymously. She wanted to see firsthand how her airline treated passengers. She had witnessed bias before. She had seen how people were judged by their clothes, their appearance, and the assumptions of others. But what Catherine Langford didn't realize was that Naomi Carter wasn't just another passenger. She was the last person you ever wanted to underestimate. Then there was Catherine Langford, a woman who moved through the world as if it belonged to her. Wealthy, privileged, arrogant. Catherine had spent her entire life controlling spaces, making sure everyone knew their place. And the moment she spotted Naomi standing in the first-class line, she decided, without hesitation, without reason, that she did not belong. Catherine had built her existence around a belief. She was superior. She deserved more. And people like Naomi Carter? They should know their place. The first-class boarding process moved smoothly, passengers adjusting their bags, checking their tickets, making last-minute calls before stepping onto the plane. And then there was Catherine Langford, standing at the front of the line, scanning the crowd with sharp, scrutinizing eyes. Then she spotted Naomi Carter. No designer labels, no flashy jewelry, no outward display of wealth. To Catherine, that was enough evidence. This woman did not belong. She barely looked at Naomi's face before jumping to a conclusion. She must be an employee, Catherine thought. She must be trying to sneak into first class. So, without hesitation, without asking a single question, Catherine issued a command. You, her voice snapped like a whip. Naomi turned, her expression neutral. Take these bags and load them properly, and be careful. I don't want any scratches on my luggage. There was no question in her tone. No doubt, just expectation. Nearby passengers froze. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. Some travelers exchanged glances, discomfort flickering in their eyes. Others averted their gazes, pretending they didn't see. And Naomi? She didn't react the way Catherine expected. No hesitation, no confusion, no awkward fumbling. Naomi simply looked at her, her face unreadable. And then, she smiled. I'm a passenger just like you, she said, her voice calm, unaffected. Catherine's face twisted in disbelief. She let out a short, dry laugh. Oh, come on, she sneered. We both know that's not true. Naomi didn't respond. She simply lifted her boarding pass, holding it effortlessly between her fingers. Catherine's annoyance turned to impatience. She stepped forward, lowering her voice, but not enough to hide the venom laced within it. "I don't know what kind of game you're trying to play here," she hissed, "but you're in the wrong line." And in true Catherine Langford fashion, she did exactly what she always did when she wanted something handled. She flagged down an employee. Catherine's voice dropped lower, but the venom remained. "I don't know what kind of game you're trying to play here, but you're in the wrong line." And in true Catherine Langford fashion, she did what she always did when she wanted something handled. She flagged down an employee. Her hand shot up, waving with the urgency of someone used to instant attention. Within seconds, a flight attendant approached. Lena Parker, a young and professional crew member, arrived with a polite but cautious expression. She had seen enough difficult passengers to recognize trouble when it found her. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" Lena asked, keeping her tone neutral. Catherine let out a dramatic sigh, gesturing toward Naomi as if she were pointing out a misplaced bag. "Yes, actually there is." Nearby passengers pretended not to listen, but their ears were tuned in. The energy in the boarding area shifted, tense and expectant. "This woman is trying to board first class," Catherine continued, speaking about Naomi as if she weren't even standing there. "I don't know how she got here, but I think she's confused." Lena blinked, her eyes flickering between Naomi's composed expression and Catherine's unwavering arrogance. She turned to Naomi. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" Without a word, Naomi handed it over. Lena scanned the ticket, checked the seat number, and then glanced back up at Naomi. Then, with absolute professionalism, she turned back to Catherine. "She's a first-class passenger, ma'am. Everything checks out." Lena was young, but she wasn't inexperienced. She knew Catherine's type, the frequent flyer who demanded extra perks, filed unnecessary complaints, and expected the world to cater to her whims. Her voice remained steady. "Ma'am, every passenger here has been properly screened. If she's in this line, she has the right to be here." Catherine let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "You've got to be kidding me." "Well, that just doesn't make sense." Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Lena tightened her grip on the scanner, discomfort clear on her face. "Ma'am, I assure you, her seat is in first class. Everything is in order." But Catherine wasn't ready to let this go. She folded her arms across her chest. "No, I don't think it is. I want to speak to a supervisor." Lena hesitated. She could feel the weight of the situation, the way eyes were shifting toward them, waiting to see how it unfolded. "There's no need for that, ma'am," Lena said carefully. "She's a confirmed first-class passenger. If you'll excuse us, we need to continue boarding." Catherine stiffened. Lena had just cut off her authority, denied her the power she was so used to wielding. And that was unacceptable. But before she could snap back, before she could escalate this into an even bigger spectacle, she noticed something. The other passengers. They were watching. And now, it wasn't just unease in their eyes, it was judgment. But not toward Naomi, toward her. Catherine hated being embarrassed more than she hated being wrong. So with a sharp inhale, she forced a tight, strained smile. "Fine." Her voice was clipped, sharp, but she backed down, for now. And as Naomi turned to board the plane, completely unfazed, untouched by Catherine's entitled fury, Catherine stared after her, watching, waiting. Because this wasn't over. Not yet, not even close. And Catherine Langford? She wasn't the type to let things go. Catherine Langford stepped onto the plane, her frustration barely concealed beneath her tight-lipped, forced smile. She had just been humiliated at the boarding gate, and she was still seething over it. She had expected Naomi to back down, to move aside, like so many others had done before when confronted with her authority. But instead, Naomi had simply stood there, unshaken, untouched by Catherine's words. And that infuriated her. Now, as Catherine moved through the first-class cabin, she scanned the seating arrangement, searching for her assigned seat. And when she found it, her stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot. She stopped abruptly, her face paled. Then immediately, it darkened with fury. She was seated right next to Naomi Carter. For a brief moment, Catherine simply stared at the seat as if it had personally offended her. Then, before she could stop herself, she let out a loud, dramatic huff, loud enough for everyone around her to hear. "Absolutely not," she snapped. "I refuse to sit here." Catherine turned her head toward Naomi, but Naomi didn't even react. She was already seated, adjusting her carry-on beneath the seat in front of her. Her expression was calm, detached, as if Catherine wasn't even worth acknowledging. The flight attendant, Lena Parker, hesitated for a brief second, momentarily caught off guard by the blatant hostility. "Ma'am, these are the assigned seats," Lena said, keeping her voice professional. "We can't make last-minute changes unless there's an available alternative." Catherine let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Oh, I think you can make an exception," she said, her tone dripping with entitlement. "There is no way I'm spending this flight next to." She stopped herself. Her eyes darted toward Naomi, her lips pressing into a tight line before she could finish whatever sentence she had been about to say. Naomi finally looked up. She raised a single eyebrow, waiting. She wasn't angry, she wasn't upset, she wasn't flustered. She just watched. Quiet, patient, unbothered. That made Catherine even angrier. Lena, growing more uncomfortable, kept her tone measured. "I understand your frustration, ma'am," she said carefully. "But we're fully booked. We don't have any open seats in first class." Catherine's lips thinned. She turned toward the other passengers, scanning the cabin as if expecting someone, anyone, to volunteer to trade seats with her. Silence. Passengers quickly busied themselves with their phones, flipping through in-flight magazines, suddenly fascinated with anything but the entitled woman demanding a seat change. Catherine wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being ignored. Her temper flared hotter. "There has to be another seat," she insisted. "I cannot sit here." Lena hesitated, then sighed. "Let me check with the crew." Catherine folded her arms even tighter, her nails digging into her sleeves as she watched Lena disappear toward the front of the cabin. Meanwhile, Naomi exhaled slowly, refocusing on her bag. She adjusted her belongings with a kind of patience that made Catherine's blood boil. How could she just sit there, unbothered, while Catherine was being so obviously inconvenienced? Moments later, Lena returned, offering an apologetic look. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said. "But as I mentioned, the flight is full. There are no other available first-class seats." Catherine's eyes flashed with irritation. "That's unacceptable." She turned toward the other passengers again, louder this time, her voice filled with exasperation. "Someone switch with me. Please. Anyone." Again, silence. Passengers pretended not to hear her, looking out the window, scrolling through their phones, suddenly fascinated with anything but the entitled woman throwing a tantrum. Then, just when it seemed like no one would step up, a voice spoke. "I'll switch." Catherine turned sharply. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man with warm eyes and a quiet demeanor met her gaze. He was dressed in a navy suit, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. Lena's shoulders sagged in relief. "That would be very helpful, sir," she said. "Thank you." Catherine straightened, a smug smirk creeping onto her face. Of course, someone had finally given in. People always did. Eventually, the man stood, gathering his things. Catherine wasted no time, yanking her carry-on from the overhead bin and sliding into her new seat as far from Naomi as possible. As she settled in, she allowed herself to breathe again. Her body relaxed into the cushioned seat. She had won. Again, or so she thought. Naomi remained as poised as ever, turning her attention back to her belongings, preparing for the flight as if none of this had even happened. Catherine clenched her jaw. But she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The tension between Naomi and Catherine had settled into something cold and unspoken. It wasn't loud anymore. It was the kind of hostility that simmered beneath the surface, the kind that didn't need words. Catherine had made it crystal clear. She wanted Naomi gone. Removed. Erased from her presence entirely. But Naomi? She wasn't here to fight for space that already belonged to her. The final boarding announcements played over the intercom. Passengers made their last-minute adjustments, slipping their carry-ons into the overhead bins before settling into their seats. Naomi stood, reaching for her luggage. The overhead bin above her seat was already packed, filled with suitcases from early boarders. She didn't make a fuss. She didn't sigh in frustration. She didn't even hesitate. Instead, she scanned the cabin for a nearby compartment with room. It didn't take long to spot one, a nearly empty bin just across from her seat. The only problem? It was directly above Catherine Langford. Naomi took a breath before stepping forward, lifting her carry-on with ease. It was the logical choice. There was ample space and the bins were shared. It was nothing more than a practical solution to a minor inconvenience. But just as she was about to place her bag inside, a sudden, forceful movement stopped her. Catherine's hand shot out, snatching Naomi's suitcase from her grip. She yanked it down with unnecessary force. The bag slammed onto the floor with a loud, jarring thud. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers turned in their seats, eyes widening at the sudden aggression. Some whispered. Others sat frozen, unsure of whether to intervene. The energy shifted instantly. Catherine was already standing, her face twisted in disgust, eyes blazing with something ugly. "Absolutely not," she snapped. "You are not putting your things near me." Catherine's voice sliced through the cabin like a blade. "Absolutely not," she snapped, her face twisted in disgust, her eyes blazing with something ugly. "You are not putting your things near me." Gasps rippled through the first-class cabin. Passengers turned in their seats, eyes widening at the sudden aggression. Some whispered, others sat frozen, unsure of whether to intervene. The energy shifted instantly. Naomi blinked, staring at Catherine with an unreadable expression. Slowly, deliberately, she bent down, picked up her bag, and dusted it off. Her composure didn't waver. She didn't lash out. She didn't retaliate. She simply stood tall, adjusting the strap of her carry-on with quiet patience. "Catherine," she said, her voice level but firm, "this is a shared cabin. Overhead bins don't belong to individual passengers." Catherine's hands clenched at her sides. Her breathing had grown heavier, more erratic. "I don't care," she spat. "I don't want your things anywhere near me." Naomi let out a slow breath. "I'm just putting my luggage away, that's all." But Catherine wasn't listening. She was spiraling, and the fact that Naomi wasn't backing down, wasn't bothered, only fueled her rage. "No," Catherine suddenly screeched. Before anyone could process what was happening, she grabbed Naomi's carry-on with both hands and hurled it forward, violently, aggressively, like she was disposing of something filthy. The suitcase hit the ground with a heavy thud, louder gasps. Passengers sat in stunned silence. A woman across the aisle put a hand over her mouth in shock. The energy in the cabin had shifted even further. It wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was disbelief. But Catherine wasn't done. Naomi bent down once more, retrieving her bag, her patience thinning now. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She simply reached for the handle. And that's when Catherine did the unthinkable. With a furious shriek, she snatched the suitcase again. This time she threw it off the plane. Passengers sat frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Naomi's carry-on tumbled through the open boarding door, landing with a heavy thud on the jet bridge below. A stunned flight attendant, who had just been returning to the cabin, stopped mid-step, her jaw slack. A crew member at the gate turned, eyes darting from the fallen suitcase to Catherine, who stood there, chest heaving, hands shaking wildly. The silence that followed was deafening. Naomi's suitcase lay discarded outside the plane, tossed like garbage, and the passengers, the flight crew, the entire first-class cabin, everyone had seen it. But Catherine? She wasn't sorry. She didn't feel remorse. She didn't feel embarrassed. If anything, the sight of Naomi standing there, still calm, still composed, still refusing to react the way Catherine wanted her to, infuriated her even more. Because Catherine wanted a scene. She wanted Naomi to break. She wanted to see her flustered, humiliated, defeated. And yet, Naomi just stood there, unshaken. That was the final straw. Something inside Catherine snapped. With a growl of frustration, she lunged forward. "You need to move," she snapped, shoving her hands toward Naomi, trying to push her out of the aisle. But Naomi was done being silent. Before Catherine's hands could make contact, Naomi's arm shot up, her grip firm, as she caught Catherine by the wrists, stopping her mid-motion. The shift in power was immediate. Catherine's entire demeanor changed. Her eyes widened. Realization dawned too late. She had pushed too far. She wasn't in control anymore. Naomi's fingers held Catherine's wrists, firm but not forceful. She wasn't attacking her. She was stopping her. But Catherine's face contorted into something vicious. She yanked at Naomi's grip and shrieked, her voice rising in fake hysteria. "Let me go. You're hurting me." Her sudden outburst was loud enough to be heard across the cabin, and that was when the supervisor came rushing in. Eyes wide, her face a mix of shock and disbelief. "What is going on here?" Catherine didn't miss a beat. She immediately switched tactics. Her entire body trembled, her voice turning high-pitched, desperate, playing the victim flawlessly. "She attacked me. Catherine wailed, pointing at Naomi with a dramatic, shaking hand. She grabbed me. She got violent. I was just defending myself. That's why I threw her bag out. She was threatening me. Naomi, still composed, slowly released Catherine's wrists. Her expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes now. Something dangerous. Something that said, Catherine Langford had just made her final mistake. That's not true, Naomi said, her voice calm but firm. The supervisor, caught between the two women, looked uncertain, her eyes darting from one to the other. Hold on, let's slow down for a second, she said, her voice measured. Miss Carter did. Catherine cut her off before she could even finish. She's violent, she shrieked, her voice trembling with manufactured fear. She needs to be removed from this plane. Arrest her. Naomi, however, said nothing. She didn't argue. She didn't plead her case, because she didn't need to. Within minutes, 2 uniformed security officers stepped onto the plane, their expressions unreadable as they made their way toward first class. A thick silence fell over the cabin. One of the officers, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke first. We've been informed there was an incident involving a disruptive passenger, he said, scanning the cabin. His eyes landed on Catherine, who immediately switched into full victim mode, her hands shaking just enough for dramatic effect. Yes, officer, she blurted out, her voice breathless, trembling. She lifted a perfectly manicured finger and pointed straight at Naomi. She threatened me. She got violent. She grabbed me. I don't feel safe sitting here. Naomi remained still, her face unreadable. The security officer turned toward her, his tone neutral but firm. Ma'am, is that true? A heavy tension filled the air, pressing down on the passengers who sat frozen in their seats. Naomi, still composed, did not shrink under the scrutiny. She simply sat with her hands resting lightly on her lap, watching the scene unfold. Catherine, however, was anything but calm. The moment she saw security step in, her confidence surged back. She straightened her posture, her breath still uneven from her fake tears, and turned her full attention to them. They don't understand, Catherine exclaimed, her voice carefully wavering. She grabbed me. She wouldn't stop. I was terrified. That's why I had to defend myself. It was a masterful performance. And worst of all, it was working. The security officer nodded firmly, his expression serious as he turned back to Naomi. Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us. Passengers gasped audibly. Some shifted uncomfortably, their faces twisting in disbelief. Others, who had missed parts of the earlier argument, now assumed the worst. But Naomi? She remained silent. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. Because she knew something Catherine didn't. The lead officer gestured for her to stand. We're going to need to remove you from the flight, ma'am. Catherine folded her arms, her expression smug. She had won, or so she thought. Because just as the officer reached for his radio to call for backup, a new voice cut through the cabin like a blade. That won't be necessary. The entire plane went still. Heads snapped toward the front of the cabin. And there, stepping onto the plane with effortless authority, was a sharply dressed airline executive. Behind him stood 2 more high-ranking officials. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence alone sent a shockwave through first class. The tension in the air shifted. Passengers sat straighter, their eyes widening. A few exchanged shocked glances. Others simply stared, trying to process what was happening. But the most notable reaction? Catherine Langford. Her face went ghostly pale. Her posture stiffened. A cold sweat crept up her spine. Because that name rang in her ears like a warning bell. Miss Carter, the executive said, his voice calm but authoritative. I deeply apologize. We had no idea you were on this flight. Passengers gasped again. Whispers rippled through the cabin. And Catherine swallowed hard. Wait, what? She stammered, looking between Naomi and the executive. Miss Carter? What? Who is she? The executive's sharp gaze snapped toward Catherine. And for the first time since she boarded this flight, Catherine Langford felt fear. Catherine felt something she wasn't used to feeling. Fear. The airline executive's expression was stone cold as he stared her down. You just harassed and attempted to remove the CEO and chief board member of this airline from her own flight. Dead silence. Catherine's heart stopped. Passengers erupted into hushed whispers, turning toward Naomi with fresh, stunned expressions. She owns this airline? Someone muttered. No way. Oh my God, she's literally the CEO. Catherine's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her thoughts scrambled for an escape, a justification, an excuse, anything, but nothing came. She had spent the last hour trying to assert her power over a woman who had more power than she could ever dream of. And now, everyone knew it. Catherine felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her, not in admiration, not in sympathy, in judgment. Passengers who had ignored the situation earlier were now fully engaged. People who had quietly agreed with Catherine's behavior now pretended they hadn't, because nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of history. Catherine's breath shook as she desperately tried to regain control. "I didn't know," she blurted out, her voice suddenly much smaller, weaker. "I thought." But before she could finish, Naomi stood, for the first time since Catherine tried to push her. Since Catherine lied, since Catherine threw her bag off the plane, Naomi rose from her seat with absolute control. And then, she looked Catherine directly in the eye. The entire plane was watching, and Naomi only said one thing: "That's exactly the problem." Catherine's lips parted slightly. Naomi's gaze never wavered. "You didn't know," she continued, her voice even, calm, "but you assumed." A hush fell over the cabin. Those words sank deep, not just into Catherine, but into everyone who had stood by, remained silent, or agreed with her. Because that was it. That was the truth Catherine had spent her entire life avoiding. She wasn't wrong because she didn't know who Naomi was. She was wrong because she assumed Naomi was less than her. She assumed Naomi didn't belong. And now, she was paying for it. Catherine's lips trembled. She wasn't the one in control anymore. She wasn't the one who got to decide how this ended. She wasn't the one with power in this room. Catherine's voice cracked. She swallowed, her fake confidence shattered. "I didn't mean, please, can we just..." Her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides. I made a mistake." But no one defended her. Not the passengers, not the flight attendants, not even the security officers, who now looked at her differently. For the first time in her life, Catherine Langford was alone. The lead security officer sighed and stepped forward, his voice professional but firm. "Miss Langford, you will be removed from this flight immediately." Catherine's head snapped toward him, panic surging in her chest. "No, you can't do that." She turned to Naomi, frantic now. "Tell them, please, I swear I didn't." But Naomi? She didn't say another word, because she didn't need to. Catherine's own actions had already spoken for her. The flight attendant who had hesitated earlier now stood with quiet satisfaction. She wouldn't be defending Catherine either. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. "Yeah, get her out of here. This is what she deserves. I'm embarrassed I didn't say something earlier." Security reached for Catherine's arm, and that was when it all fell apart. No, this isn't fair," Catherine shrieked, her voice rising in desperation. "I'm the victim here." But it didn't matter. The entire first-class cabin watched as Catherine Langford, who once held herself so high, so untouchable, so above everyone else, was now being escorted off the flight. Passengers began clapping. The sound of cheering rang through the cabin. Catherine was still screaming, still trying to control a situation she had already lost. But now, nobody was listening. And as she disappeared from sight, Naomi exhaled slowly and sat back down. A flight attendant approached, her voice softer this time. "Miss Carter, is there anything we can do to make this right?" Naomi, still composed, shook her head with a small, knowing smile. "No, I think the lesson has already been taught." The murmurs in the cabin turned into quiet respect, and for the first time since this ordeal began, the plane finally felt peaceful. Catherine Langford had always believed she was untouchable. She had walked through life believing the rules didn't apply to her, that she could push boundaries, that she could demand special treatment, that she could get away with behavior that others would be punished for. But today, that illusion had crumbled. And it was crumbling even further as she was dragged off the plane, kicking and screaming. Catherine thought the worst was over, that she could salvage the situation somehow, that she could complain to the right people, demand a refund, call her lawyer, make it all go away. She was wrong, and just as she was being led away, a voice called out, "Miss Langford." Catherine turned sharply, her head snapping toward the sound of her name. Standing tall in a perfectly tailored suit was the lead airline executive. He held a folder in one hand, his expression neutral yet cold. Catherine's stomach clenched. The airline wasn't about to let her walk away without consequences. She straightened her posture, summoning the last of her bravado. She smoothed her blouse, lifted her chin, and plastered on a smug expression. "Oh, finally," she huffed, placing a hand on her hip. "I need to file a complaint about that entire ordeal. I was mistreated. No, I was harassed on that plane." The executive didn't blink. He didn't react. He didn't even seem remotely interested in what she had to say. Instead, he simply extended the folder toward her. "Miss Langford," he said, his voice cool, emotionless, final. "Effective immediately, you are permanently banned from all future flights on this airline." Catherine froze. For a moment, her brain refused to process the words. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, but nothing came out. She felt the world shift beneath her feet. Then, like a volcano erupting, the shock gave way to rage. "What? You can't do this to me!" she shrieked, her voice carrying across the entire terminal. Heads turned. Passengers waiting for their flights lifted their eyes from their phones. People from different gates peered over, curious. Some already had their cameras out, recognizing her as the woman who had just been kicked off that flight. The executive remained completely unfazed. He gave a slow, measured nod. "Actually, we can," he said, tilting his head slightly. "And we just did." Catherine's entire body shook. Her fists clenched, her face turned a shade of red so deep it almost looked unnatural. "You think I'm just going to accept this?" she spat. "I have connections. I'll have your job for this." Gasps rippled through the watching crowd. Some passengers muttered to each other. Others started laughing, because Catherine sounded ridiculous. And the executive? He looked downright bored. "Miss Langford," he said, his tone unwavering. "This airline has a zero-tolerance policy for harassment, discrimination, and unruly behavior. Your actions today have resulted in a permanent travel ban across all our flights, effective immediately. You will receive an official notice via email, and any attempt to book a future ticket will be automatically declined." Catherine was shaking now. The reality was finally sinking in. "No," she screamed, stomping her foot like a child. No, I'm the victim here." Laughter spread through the terminal. A teenager whispered to her friend, "Does she actually think this is helping?" A middle-aged woman scoffed, shaking her head. "She did this to herself." And the recording? It was already spreading. For the second time today, Catherine had created her own downfall. And this time, there was no recovering from it. The executive let out a tired sigh, clearly done with her tantrum. He motioned to security. "Please escort Miss Langford out of the terminal." Catherine gasped, horrified. "No, you can't. I have a flight to catch. I have places to be." One of the security officers calmly took her by the arm. "Not on this airline, ma'am." And just like that, Catherine Langford, the woman who thought she ruled first class, the woman who had spent her entire life demanding special treatment, the woman who had tried to remove the CEO of the airline from her own flight, was now being dragged out of the airport like an unruly child. Passengers in the waiting area clapped. Some even cheered. A businessman chuckled, shaking his head. "I love to see karma in real time." A woman whispered to her friend, "She's definitely going viral." And Catherine? Her final words before disappearing from sight? "I'll sue you. I'll sue this whole airline. This isn't over." But even she knew. It was over, because she wasn't just kicked off a flight. She wasn't just humiliated. She wasn't just banned from an airline. She had been exposed. And in the age of social media, that was something she would never escape. The world had turned against her now. She was a joke. Her name was everywhere. News outlets had picked up the story within hours. The viral clips, her tantrum on the plane, her screaming meltdown at the gate, the smug confidence draining from her face when she learned who Naomi Carter really was. All of it spread across every social media platform imaginable. People weren't just talking about the flight. They were digging into her past. And Catherine? She was losing everything. Her inbox was flooded with angry emails. She had been let go from multiple business engagements. Brands she had partnered with were cutting ties. Her family was receiving messages from reporters asking for statements. She had gone from living a life of privilege to becoming one of the most hated women on the internet. And now, she had one option left: the apology. The camera clicked on. A dimly lit room, a blank wall behind her. Catherine sat in front of the camera, her face bare, her eyes red-rimmed as if she had spent hours crying. She sniffled, wiping at her cheek, her breath shaky as she looked directly into the lens. I made a terrible mistake. She took a deep, trembling breath. I was wrong. Her voice cracked at just the right moment. I let my ignorance cloud my judgment. I never meant to hurt anyone, but I see now that my actions were inexcusable, and I take full responsibility. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She let it stay there, the perfect balance of remorse and fragility. She had studied apology videos before. She knew exactly how to make herself look like the victim. To Carter, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, I deeply regret how I treated you. I don't know what came over me. I was overwhelmed. I was frustrated, but that doesn't excuse my behavior. You didn't deserve that. No one does. She exhaled shakily, as if the weight of her actions had just now hit her. I spent the last few days reflecting, and I realize now that I need to change. I need to listen. I need to learn. And I promise to do better. Her lips trembled. I hope the world can find it in their hearts to forgive me. She let the weight of her words linger. Then, with a final broken breath, she ended the video. Within minutes, she posted it. The caption read, I'm truly sorry. Please take the time to watch this and understand my heart. She sat back, watching the screen. Waiting. Would people accept it? Would they finally stop attacking her? Would she get her life back? The first comment came in, then the second. Then, the flood began, and Catherine's stomach dropped. Because instead of sympathy, instead of support, instead of forgiveness, she saw this. Nah, you're just sorry you got caught. We don't believe you. You had no remorse when you were throwing that bag and trying to get her arrested. Too little, too late. Classic PR apology. Zero emotion, zero sincerity, zero accountability. The likes on those comments skyrocketed. More poured in. People mocked her. They dissected her video. They called out her forced tears. They pointed out how she was still making it about herself. And then, the memes exploded. Someone posted a compilation of her apology mixed with her screaming on the plane. Another edited the video to add fake Oscar-winning music behind her performance. One tweet went viral. If you ever feel bad about your mistakes, just remember that Catherine Langford thought she could fake cry her way out of this mess and made it even worse. Over 1 million likes. Catherine felt sick. She had hoped that this would be enough. But the world had already made up its mind. Her apology wasn't an apology, it was damage control. And nobody was buying it. The downfall of Catherine Langford was officially complete.